The forces under Cornwallis's command were low on supplies. At Yorktown, Cornwallis spent 3 months digging while waiting for his rendezvous with Admiral Rodney. The British fleet commanded by Rodney was supposed to be the most important factor in the outcome of the showdown between the British Army and the combined forces of the Americans and the French. Supplies and reinforcements were to be brought by Rodney. This was the reason Cornwallis hadn't marched farther north. Rodney had other plans. Instead of sailing north, when he had the advantage over the French, he launched a vicious attack on tiny St. Eustatius. While Cornwallis's army had its head in an ever-tightening noose that could be relieved only by Rodney's ships, supplies, and fresh troops, Rodney stayed to loot St. Eustatius. His army spent valuable time confiscating everything from almost every citizen of the tiny island. In fact, he instructed his men to go as far as looting graves, claiming that valuables had been buried. Meanwhile, Washington and Rochambeau used the 3 months well, coordinating their cross-country march and the arrival of the 164th Lodge in the Revolution French fleet. Lafayette used a small force to block an English retreat. Washington and Rochambeau rushed to cover 500 miles, and Admiral de Grasse sailed up from the Caribbean with 20 ships and 3,000 fresh troops. François-Joseph Ball, the Marquis de Grasse d'Illy, and Comte de Grasse had joined the fleet of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, also known as the Knights of Malta, at age 12. This was the original order known as the Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, and was established even before the Knights Templar. While both orders were ostensibly Catholic, the exposure to different faiths may have had a lasting effect on the Templars, who supported the Cathari during the Papal Crusade, and were accused of heresy. The Hospitallers had no such crisis of faith, but they needed a reason to exist after the Crusades. They took refuge in the Mediterranean, where they waged endless wars against the Barbary pirates to protect Christian shipping. After 6 years of training, de Grasse was attached to the French Navy. Like his fellow Knights of Malta, de Grasse had an interest in the American cause of liberty. He was joined by 19 other knights in the effort. After the war, 14 joined Washington's Society of Cincinnati. 8 Admiral de Grasse became part of the French Revolution, retiring when the excessive bloodshed stained the cause of liberty. Admiral de Grasse had overnight become a key figure in the Revolutionary War. 9 With a fleet of 20 ships, he sailed from France in March. His fleet, including the Ville de Paris, the largest warship in the world, guided a convoy of 150 merchant ships carrying supplies for the war. De Grasse reached Martinique in late April, and sent 30 ships with troops and supplies to Rochambeau. The resupply included the infantry of Marquis Claude Henry de Saint-Simon, and the ancient regiments of Agenais, Gâtinais, and Touraine. De Grasse's fleet found action almost immediately after landing the merchant ships. In late April, de Grasse encountered the British Navy. This first brief action was later described as indecisive, but the British lost 6 warships, which had lasting effect. De Grasse had outmaneuvered the fleet of Admiral Hood, which was under the command of Admiral Rodney. The bride that won the war 165 Hood blamed his early loss on Rodney's incorrect positioning of his ships. It was Rodney's second mistake, but certainly not his last. 5 weeks later Rodney again ran into the French fleet. On June 5 Rodney's navy reached the French fleet, counted 24 ships and 5 frigates, and chose to do nothing. Rodney had the advantage of size, yet he failed to pursue de Grasse, allowing the French admiral to head north to Virginia. But Rodney was aware of the crucial importance of French naval and military support in determining the outcome at Yorktown. Still, he failed to give priority to stopping, or even slowing the French assistance. The most critical engagement of the war was decided on which side was more prepared for the battle. The American and French side needed Admiral de Grasse. The British side needed Admiral Rodney. There is ample evidence that both naval commanders were aware of their importance. Admiral de Grasse was scheduled to rendezvous with 30 American pilots who were necessary for navigating Chesapeake Bay. De Grasse supplied his food stores in a hurry, and chartered 15 new merchant ships to carry food. Not wishing to wait for letters of credit, he paid for the supplies with his own money. While it seems that Rodney had failed to understand the implications of his delay, his actions prove otherwise. He dispatched a warning to Admiral Graves in New York, stating that the French Navy was on the way. He told Graves that both fleets needed to link up to prevent the French Navy from supplying Rochambeau and Washington. The first message was intercepted. The second arrived days after the French fleet had already destroyed part of Graves' fleet. Rodney even wrote to his wife that he would attack the French, if given the opportunity, and that the fate of England may depend upon the event. Given the evidence of Rodney's letters, it is shocking that he chose to then split his forces and sail home with his loot from St. Eustatius. This final action can hardly be deemed a mistake. Rodney deserted his post. At the same time that he abandoned his mission, Rodney warned his charge, Admiral Graves, of just how important it was to bring the fleet to Yorktown. Rodney's actions, combined with the lack of timeliness of 166 the lodge in the Revolution, his warnings, contributed to the American and French victory. Historians have pointed out that Rodney's errors may have been attributable to problems with his health. But the true cause of the victory at Yorktown is that Admiral Rodney allowed himself to be defeated on purpose. In doing so, he ensured the French-American victory, which was allowed to repay a monumental debt. The motive was mentioned earlier. In 1774 Rodney fled to Paris, to escape debtor's prison. 10 The gambler was still in Paris in 1778 and still an admiral, though he did not have a post. Rodney had been put on a half-salary by his superior, the Earl of Sandwich. The Earl of Sandwich, when not at the gambling tables himself, served as Lord of the Admiralty. The Earl was also a friend of Benjamin Franklin through their shared adventures at Wycombe. After nearly 4 years in exile, Rodney was informed that he was being recalled to active duty. It was an opportunity to rebuild his fortune and his career, but because of new debts incurred in France, the down-and-out admiral could not return to England to accept his command. Even worse, he could not rebuild his fortune without the command. Then, seemingly out of the blue, a French noble and commander of the French Guard offered to help Rodney. The Marechal Duc de Biron offered Admiral Rodney the money needed to pay off his debts and assume his command. Some historians call it a loan, others call it a gift. In either case, the implications are staggering. It seems that at least one of the two parties was committing an act that could be deemed treason. While Rodney's reasons were evident, one must wonder, what was the French commander's motivation? When the offer was made, the Duc de Biron's nephew was Armand Louis de Gontaut, the Duc de Lauzun. It is unreasonable to think that the Duc de Biron actually wished to help Rodney take his post. In doing so, the Duke would be aware that he might be contributing to the bribe that won the war 167 nephew's defeat or even death. Apparently the well-timed loan or gift to Rodney was the one way the Duc de Biron could ensure his nephew's success. The loan was a bribe, and that bribe won the war. Rodney upheld his part of the bargain. When he could have pursued the advantage, he chose to wait. When he could have stopped the French fleet, he chose to defend Tobago. When he could have raced to Yorktown, he decided it was time to punish St. Eustatius. Finally, he simply headed home. The world turned upside down. Rochambeau and Washington continued to tighten the siege around Yorktown. Lafayette had been reinforced with the fresh troops of St. Simon. Meanwhile, 4,000 British troops sat in New York Harbor and Rodney's partner Graves waited. When Rodney's message arrived, the Brits set sail. It was then 2 days after the surrender at Yorktown, when the British fleet was informed of Cornwallis's defeat. They simply turned around. After losing the war, Britain would go through a long series of blaming people. While others pointed their fingers at their fellow commanders, Rodney seemed above the fray. The reason was that before any charges of incompetence, cowardice, or treason could be leveled against him, he returned to the West Indies to become a hero. Despite the surprising victory at Yorktown, it would still be more than a year before Britain ended the hostilities. Clinton in New York still had a standing army during this lull, and Rodney returned to pursue the French fleet. He sighted the French fleet under De Grasse sailing for Jamaica. The same French commander that he avoided meeting prior to Yorktown he now chased.